He already knew how it was going to end. That was the part nobody talked about afterward, not in the debrief, not in the official report, and certainly not in the version that made it into the regional security bulletin 3 weeks later. Colonel Dmitry Vanik had been running cross-border pressure operations for 11 years. He understood terrain, he understood logistics, and standing at the ridgeline above the Cassiar Valley, with his field scope trained on the relay station 4 kilometers north, he understood that what he was looking at was a problem that had already solved itself. 12 Canadian Rangers, 1 functioning communications relay, 2 supply vehicles that hadn't moved in 72 hours, and a mountain pass that would be impassable within 48 hours once the weather system rolling in from the coast reached the valley floor. He didn't need to attack, he just needed to wait. He closed the scope, tucked it into his chest pocket, and told his second-in-command to get some sleep. Warrant Officer Sylvie Marceau had arrived at Station Keller 6 days earlier with a duffel bag, a hard case that nobody had asked about, and orders that read, in their entirety, temporary assignment, signal support, duration TBD. She was 31 years old. She had the kind of face that people forgot 10 minutes after meeting her. Not unattractive, just unremarkable in the way that people who have learned to be unremembered tend to become. Her hair was dark, pulled back. She wore her rank without decoration. The station commander, Captain Elgin, had looked at her orders, looked at her, and looked at the hard case. Signal support, he said. Yes, sir. We have 2 signal specialists. Yes, sir. He waited for more. She didn't offer any. He assigned her a bunk in the secondary quarters, a post at the Eastern Monitoring Station, and a rotating shift that put her on watch at 0300 when, in his considerable experience, nothing happened. She thanked him and carried her own case. What Elgin didn't know, what almost nobody in the station knew, was that Sylvie Marceau had spent 4 years with the Special Operations Forces before a bureaucratic reclassification had moved her file to a category that existed, officially, in the administrative annex of 2 departments simultaneously. She was not technically a ranger. She was not technically signals. The designation on her file read analytical support, which was the kind of language that meant something very specific to the 3 people who had written her last performance evaluation and meant very little to anyone else. What she was, more precisely, was this. She could calculate bullet trajectory in variable crosswind at distances beyond 2,000 meters with the kind of accuracy that required either years of disciplined practice or a particular arrangement of spatial reasoning that most people simply didn't have. She had both. The hard case held a accuracy international AXMC chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum. Fitted with a Night Force optic, she had zeroed herself at a range outside Petawawa 14 months ago and not touched since. She maintained it the way some people maintain relationships, consistently, without drama, and with the understanding that the investment would matter eventually. She had been sent to Station Keller because someone, somewhere in the intelligence chain, had flagged an anomaly in the movement pattern of a paramilitary element operating in the buffer zone. The anomaly was subtle. It had the shape of patience, and patience in this context was the most dangerous thing possible, because patience meant someone was waiting for a natural outcome rather than forcing one. The natural outcome, in this case, was the weather. Sylvie understood this on her 3rd day. She pulled the weather data, cross-referenced it with the movement logs, and sat for 40 minutes with a paper map and a pencil doing the kind of arithmetic that most people needed software for. Then she went to see Captain Elgin. He was reviewing maintenance schedules. "Sir," she said, "I need to discuss the station's vehicle disposition." He looked up. "Marceau, the 2 supply trucks, they're positioned on the northern access road. They're positioned where they were when I arrived." "Yes, sir. That's the problem." Elgin set down his papers. He was not an unintelligent man. He had spent 12 years in the Canadian Rangers, had done 2 rotations in the Arctic and 1 in the Balkans, and had developed an instinct for the particular tone of voice that indicated a subordinate was about to tell him something he didn't want to hear. "Explain," she explained. She laid out the weather timeline, the movement pattern, the logical conclusion. She was precise, and she was brief, and she did not editorialize. When she finished, Elgin was quiet for a moment. That's a significant assessment based on limited data, he said. You're suggesting someone is deliberately waiting for the past to close. I'm suggesting the pattern is consistent with that interpretation. And your recommendation? Reposition the vehicles to the southern staging area. Move the antenna array to the secondary mast. And, she paused just briefly, let me set up on the eastern ridge. Elgin looked at the hard case, which he had not stopped thinking about since she arrived. What's in that case, warrant officer? Signals equipment, she said. He almost smiled. Get out of my office, Marceau. She got out. She also, over the next 18 hours, began quietly repositioning her kit. The paramilitary element, Vanek's people, numbered 23. They had 3 light vehicles, 2 of which were equipped with communications jammers, and a 4th vehicle carrying a crew-served weapon that had been photographed once, from altitude 6 weeks before Sylvie arrived at Keller. The photograph was in a file. The file was in an office in Ottawa. Nobody had connected it to the Keller weather anomaly because nobody had been looking at both things simultaneously. She wasn't supposed to have access to the photograph. She had access anyway through a channel that she had cultivated during her S-off years and maintained out of the professional habit of keeping useful things close. When she pulled the image up on her encrypted tablet at 0230 on her 4th night at the station, she spent a long time looking at the dimensions of the vehicle, the crew configuration, and the angle of the weapon mount. Then she spent a long time looking at the terrain map. Then she did more arithmetic. The number she arrived at was 2,740 meters. That was the distance from the only position with adequate elevation and concealment, a shelf of rock on the eastern ridge, accessible by a 4-hour hike through terrain that didn't appear on the standard patrol routes, to the natural choke point where the valley road narrowed between 2 rock faces. If someone wanted to funnel a small force into a kill zone, the choke point was the obvious location. If someone wanted to stop a force before it reached the choke point without triggering a full engagement, they would need to reach the shelf. She started hiking at 0100. The temperature was -19. The wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 35 kilometers per hour, with gusts she estimated at 50. She wore a white oversuit over her thermals, carried the hard case on her back with the kind of practiced economy of movement that meant she had done this, or something very much like it, many times before. She did not use a headlamp. She had memorized the route from the topo map. She reached the shelf at 0512. The sky was beginning to differentiate, the eastern edge going from black to a deep, bruised purple. She set up in a natural depression in the rock, packed snow around the edges of her position for thermal concealment, and began the process of range estimation. This was the part that took longer than the shooting. She had a laser rangefinder, but she used it sparingly. The return pulse was detectable by the right kind of equipment. Instead, she worked from known reference points. The rocks formation she had identified on the topo map, the slight elevation change at the 1,800-meter mark, the positioning of Vanek's vehicles, which she could now see through the scope with clarity that made her slow her breathing automatically. 3 vehicles on the near approach. One farther back, partially obscured by a stand of spruce, the one with the weapon mount. She logged each position. She checked the wind with a kestrel held flat to the shelf. She made her calculations. Then she waited. Back at Station Keller, Captain Elgin had started the morning briefing without Marceau, noted her absence with the controlled irritation of someone who had already, on some level, decided to file a report, and was interrupted 40 minutes in by Private Lachlan II, who had come directly from the monitoring station and whose face carried the particular expression of someone who had just seen something they didn't have language for yet. "Sir," II said, "the eastern sensor grid is showing a vehicle column. Northern approach." Elgin was on his feet before II finished the sentence. There were 12 people in Station Keller. They were equipped for monitoring and relay support. They had 2 rifles between the non-specialist personnel, both of which were carbines with effective ranges suited for close defense. They were not equipped for an engagement with a vehicle column. They were not in any operational planning document expected to be. The communications relay was also, as of 40 minutes prior, experiencing intermittent interference on 3 of its 4 primary frequencies. Elgin's signals team was working the problem. It was not a coincidence. He understood that immediately, with the cold clarity of someone whose instincts had just been vindicated in the worst possible way. He keyed his radio and got static. He tried the backup frequency. Static. He looked at 2. "Get me anything," he said. "Satellite phone. Runner anything." 2 ran. Elgin walked to the window. The column was not yet visible. It would be another 20 minutes at its current rate of movement before it reached the approach visible from the station. He thought about the supply trucks, which were now, he noted with something between gratitude and fury, parked in the southern staging area. He thought about Marceau. He thought about the hard case. He thought, she's already out there. He didn't know if that made him feel better or worse. The first vehicle in the column reached the open ground at 0741. Sylvie was watching it through the scope. She had been in position for 2 hours and 29 minutes. Her hands were not cold because she had trained herself to manage heat distribution. Her breathing was controlled. Her heart rate, which she monitored by feel rather than instrument, was in the mid-50s. She was thinking about wind. The crosswind had shifted in the last 20 minutes. Not dramatically. The sustained speed was roughly the same, but the direction had changed by approximately 8 degrees. And at 2,700 meters, 8 degrees of directional variance in a 30-plus wind required a recalculation that most people would have managed with software. She managed it with the part of her brain that had been trained to treat ballistic arc the way musicians treat rhythm. Not as a calculation, but as a felt thing, a sense of where the note was going to land. She adjusted her hold. She verified her position. She checked the ranging one more time. The column had 3 vehicles on the road. The crew-served weapon vehicle was still back, still partially concealed. She wasn't going to touch that one first. What she was going to do, and she had decided this on the hike up, working through the problem the way she worked through all problems, systematically and without sentiment, was not shoot at people. She was going to shoot at the road. More specifically, she was going to shoot at the rock face above the choke point, at a point she had calculated would release approximately 3 to 4 tons of loose aggregate onto the road surface in a way that would render it impassable for light vehicles without a recovery crew and several hours of work. There was a secondary position, a natural fracture in the rock wall on the western side of the choke point that she estimated would handle the vehicle that tried to reverse. She was not trying to win a fight. She was trying to make the fight logistically impossible. The first round took the rock face at 0743, 11 seconds after she'd settled into her final breath. The sound reached the valley floor 7.9 seconds after that. She counted it from the scope, and by then she was already cycling the bolt and adjusting for what she expected to be a 4-centimeter elevation drop on the secondary target due to temperature effects on the propellant. The secondary round hit 7 seconds later. The effect was not immediate. That was something people misunderstood about this kind of thing. The collapse of rock wasn't instantaneous. It was a cascade. And for about 3 seconds after the second impact, the road below the face looked entirely normal. Then the upper section gave, and then the section below that, and then approximately 2 tons of broken limestone came down across 40 meters of road surface in a way that, even from 2,700 meters, she could see was not going to be cleared by anyone without equipment she was confident they didn't have. The column stopped. She watched the vehicles through the scope. She could see figures moving, the particular body language of people who are trying to understand what just happened and where it came from. They were looking at the rock fall. Some of them were looking at the ridge, the wrong ridge, the western one, which was the obvious position, and therefore not where she was. She did not move. This was also something that required training. The discipline of stillness after action, the understanding that the period immediately following a shot was when most people made the mistakes that got them located. She pressed herself into the depression, slowed her breathing further, and watched. The crew-served weapon vehicle had come forward. She could see the crew repositioning. They were trying to get elevation on the western ridge. She logged this. She also noted the time, 0751. The weather system was going to hit the valley by approximately 1400. The pass would be impassable by 1600. If the column couldn't get through the choke point in the next 4 hours, it wasn't getting through today. It wasn't getting through. She did the math on that too. At Station Keller, the monitoring station had picked up the impacts as seismic events, small, sharp, localized. Private 2, who had studied geology before enlisting, looked at the readout and then looked at Sergeant Dale Whitmore, the station's senior NCO, and said, "That's not natural." "No," Whitmore agreed. "That's someone's doing something to the road." "Yes." They stood with that for a moment. "Marceau," Whitmore said, "has to be." Whitmore looked at the sensor display, at the column that had stopped moving, at the distance between the column's current position and the station. Then he did something he had not expected to do that morning. He sat down in the monitoring chair with the careful deliberateness of someone who has just realized that the situation is, at least for the moment, not his to manage. "Get the satellite phone working," he said, "and somebody make coffee. We're going to be here for a while." Sylvie stayed on the shelf for 4 more hours. She didn't fire again. There was no need. The road was blocked. The column was not going to attempt a flanking movement in terrain they hadn't reconnoitered, and the weather was coming. She watched them through the scope with the patient attention of someone who has committed to an outcome and simply needs to wait for it to resolve. She saw 3 separate conferences among the figures near the vehicles. She saw the crew-served weapon traverse once toward the eastern ridge, and then traverse back, when the crew apparently decided there was nothing there. She watched the wind pick up. She watched the first clouds reach the upper valley. She thought about her mother, briefly, in the way that unexpected moments of stillness sometimes allow. Her mother had been a surveyor. She had spent Sylvie's childhood explaining how to read the land, how distance was not just a measurement, but a relationship between point of origin and destination, and how the land itself was always a participant in whatever you were doing on it. Sylvie had absorbed this without knowing it was unusual. She had only understood what she had been given when she started training and found, to the instructor's visible surprise, that she already knew things she wasn't supposed to know yet. At 1347, the column began to withdraw. She watched them go. She did not experience this as triumph. It was closer to the feeling of completing a long calculation, the satisfaction of the answer aligning with the method. She had seen the problem. She had identified the solution. The solution had worked. She broke down her position with the same economy she had set it up with, distributing the disturbed snow to approximate its previous state, packing the case. She started the hike back at 1402, moving faster on the descent, but not carelessly. The wind was building. The first snow began to fall at 1430. She reached the station at 1817. Captain Elgin was in the operations room with Sergeant Whitmore and 4 others when she came through the door. He looked at her for a long moment. She set the case down beside the door and began unwrapping her outer layer. "Report," he said. She gave it, concisely in the order of events. She included the range, the rounds fired, the observed effects, and her assessment of the column's likely timeline for any second approach given the weather and their vehicle damage from the rockfall. She did not include anything that wasn't operationally relevant. When she finished, Elgin was quiet. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind had moved from building to full storm, and the sound of it against the station walls was a low, constant pressure. "You fired 2 rounds, Elgin said. "Yes, sir. At the road, at the rock face above the road. Yes, sir." He looked at the window, at the snow moving sideways past the glass, "And your assessment is that the pass is now closed until at least 72 hours minimum. Given the forecast, probably 5 days. 5 days. Yes, sir." He turned back to her. She could see him working through it, the decision tree of someone in command trying to determine whether what had just happened was a violation of his operational parameters, a breach of her assignment scope, or something else entirely. She waited. "The vehicles are safe," he said finally. "The station is secure. We have communications." The interference stopped when they started pulling back. "Yes, sir, the jammers were in the rear vehicle." Another silence. Whitmore was watching Elgin with the careful attention of a senior NCO who has learned when to speak and when to be a witness. "Marceau," Elgin said. "Sir, what exactly is your posting?" "Signal support, sir." He looked at the case. He looked at her. And then, With the air of a man who has decided that certain questions are better left unasked until he has had time to think about what answers he actually wants, he said, "Get some sleep. We debrief at 0800. She picked up the case. "Marceau." She stopped. "Good work," he said. It was not effusive. It was not decorated. It landed exactly as he intended it. The precise acknowledgement from one professional to another that the thing that needed doing had been done. She nodded once and went to her bunk. The debrief at 0800 lasted 3 hours. A secure line was established to Petawawa at 1100, and the call lasted another 90 minutes. Sylvie was present for parts of both. For other parts, she was asked to wait in the corridor, which she did, standing with her back to the wall and her hands at her sides, looking at the middle distance with the particular stillness of someone who is not waiting anxiously, but simply waiting. The official record, when it was compiled, noted that Station Keller had experienced an attempted incursion by an unidentified paramilitary element, that the element had been successfully deterred by a terrain denial action of an unspecified nature, and that no Canadian personnel had been injured. The operational details were classified at a level that put them in a file that would not be reviewed for 7 years. Sylvie's name appeared once in the document in the personnel section where it read, "Woes Marceau, attached signal support." She read this 3 weeks later in a different city while eating a sandwich she had bought from a Vietnamese place near her temporary billet. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and finished her lunch. There was a second file. She didn't see that one. It wasn't for her. It went to a small office in a building on Sussex Drive where 3 people spent an afternoon reading it, and then one of them made a phone call, and then someone adjusted an administrative classification, and then a new assignment was generated. The assignment arrived on Sylvie's encrypted tablet 4 days later. It read in its entirety, "Temporary assignment, Northern Operational Support, duration TBD." She looked at it for a moment. Then she reached under the bunk and pulled out the hard case to check the 0 on the scope. Because that was how you prepared for something you couldn't fully anticipate, not with anxiety, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, systematic attention to the things that were in your control, so that when the things outside your control arrived, you were already ready. The wind outside was from the northwest. She noted it and went back to work.